The human mind tends to operate on a default program, from the moment we open our eyes in the morning to the second we close them at night. A sequence of conditioned responses dictates the quality of our decisions, the direction of our focus, and ultimately, the reality we construct. Most individuals move through life responding to stimuli rather than directing focus. They react to the urgent at the expense of the important, and they mistake movement for progress. To look at the top 1% of performers in any domain, whether in organizational leadership, strategic decision-making, or creative mastery, is not to observe a different species, but to observe a different cognitive operating system. This is not about inherent superiority or hidden secrets. It is about a deliberate, disciplined departure from standard cognitive habits. It is about shifting from a reactive posture to a highly strategic, deeply self-aware state of execution. Consider the architecture of an ordinary day. For the vast majority, reality is something that happens to them. A market shift occurs, a crisis emerges, or an unexpected variable disrupts a plan, and the immediate response is emotional fluctuation. There is an inflation of stress, a clouding of judgment, and a subsequent rush toward mitigation that often compounds the original issue. The individual is trapped in a loop of constant firefighting. The top 1%, however, tend to view the exact same landscape through a completely inverted lens. Where the default mind sees an chaotic emergency, the disciplined mind identifies a data point. Where the majority experiences an emotional hijacking, the strategic mind experiences an intensification of clarity. This difference is not accidental. It is the result of a profound internal rewiring that prioritizes emotional regulation, cognitive flexibility, and a relentless commitment to objective reality. To think like the top 1% is to cultivate an extraordinary tolerance for ambiguity. In a world that craves immediate certainty, the most effective minds understand that rushing to a conclusion is often a form of cognitive cowardice. It is an attempt to alleviate the discomfort of not knowing. The exceptional performer does not force a premature answer. Instead, they sit with the complexity, observing the variables, separating noise from signal, and recognizing that true strategic clarity emerges only when the emotional desire for immediate comfort is entirely subdued. They do not look for what they want to see. They train themselves to see exactly what is there, stripped of narrative, preference, and ego. This shift in perspective requires a fundamental reframing of how we view human capability. We are frequently conditioned to believe that high achievement is a byproduct of massive, heroic actions taken in moments of public prominence. We love the narrative of the sudden breakthrough, the strokes of genius, and the dramatic pivot. But reality operates on a much quieter scale. The trajectory of a life is rarely altered by a single monumental choice. It is reshaped degree by degree, through thousands of micro-decisions made in isolation, when no one is watching, and when there is no immediate reward. It is the compounding effect of choosing clarity over comfort, accountability over excuse, and discipline over distraction, day after day after day. When we examine the behavioral patterns of those who operate at the highest echelons of execution, we find a distinct approach to the concept of time. The average individual trades their time for immediate gratification or short-term security. They operate in cycles of days, weeks, or perhaps months. Their strategic horizon is remarkably short. Conversely, the top 1% tend to think in years, decades, and generations. They understand that any meaningful endeavor requires a long runway, and they possess the emotional maturity to invest energy into systems that may not yield visible results for an extended period. This long-form thinking alters every daily choice. It filters out trivial conflicts. It eliminates the urge to engage in superficial competitions, and it focuses the entire cognitive apparatus on sustainable, scalable progress. This audiobook script is designed to dissect this cognitive architecture. It is an exploration of the psychological shifts required to elevate your thinking from the baseline of the majority to the disciplined precision of the exceptional. We will not explore shortcuts, nor will we engage in superficial motivational rhetoric. Motivation is an unstable emotion, a fleeting state of mind that deserts you the moment friction increases. We are interested in something far more permanent: infrastructure. We are here to build a mental framework that survives pressure, adapts to volatility, and converts raw potential into deliberate, ethical, and powerful action. To begin this journey, we must first confront the primary barrier to high-level thinking, the comfort of the consensus. The majority consensus is highly comfortable because it demands very little rigorous self-examination. It allows an individual to externalize blame, to adopt pre-packaged beliefs, and to move along the path of least resistance. But this comfort carries an astronomical cost. It ensures mediocrity. It guarantees that your outcomes will match the outcomes of the collective, which are often defined by anxiety, stagnation, and unfulfilled capacity. To separate yourself from the consensus is not an act of arrogance, it is an act of profound personal responsibility. It is the recognition that if you desire outcomes that the majority do not possess, you must be willing to think in ways the majority cannot sustain. As we move forward, remember that this process is active, not passive. Listening to these words is merely an intellectual exercise until they are forged in the crucible of your daily choices. The transformation from a reactive thinker to a strategic architect of your reality happens in the precise moment you feel the urge to slip back into old patterns and consciously choose a higher standard. It happens when you choose to listen, when you want to speak, when you choose to analyze, when you want to judge, and when you choose to execute, when you want to delay. Let us begin by stepping away from the noise of the collective, settling into a state of absolute focus, and exploring the fundamental principles that govern the minds of those who truly operate at the pinnacle of human capability. The architecture of cognitive insulation. To operate at the highest level of human capability, an individual must first construct what can be termed cognitive insulation. Every single day, the human brain is bombarded by an unprecedented volume of information, opinions, demands, and emotional currents. The default state of the human mind is to absorb this environmental noise indiscriminately. Most people act as open networks, allowing every external event, every social media trend, and every minor corporate friction to penetrate their internal space, disrupt their emotional equilibrium, and dictate their cognitive focus. This creates a state of chronic mental fragmentation. The top 1% of strategic minds operate on an entirely different structural premise. They view their attention not as an infinite resource to be scattered, but as their primary currency. It is the single most valuable asset they possess. To protect it, they build a psychological barrier between their internal analytical processing and the chaotic external world. This is not isolationism, it is strategic filtration. It is the understanding that to process reality with high precision, you must control the quality, quantity, and velocity of the data you allow into your mind. Consider the phenomenon of a sudden market downturn or a major organizational crisis. The baseline response within most teams is an immediate escalation of noise. Communication channels overflow with speculative narratives, anxiety-driven projections, and defensive posture. This is the collective mind in a state of hyper-reactivity. An elite strategic thinker observes this chaos from a position of deliberate psychological distance. They do not allow the collective panic to validate itself within their own consciousness. Instead, they isolate the raw variables. They strip away the adjectives, the emotional hyperbole, and the fear-based predictions. They reduce the crisis to its core components: what is objectively true, what is unknown, what is within our immediate sphere of influence. By insulating their cognitive process from the surrounding emotional contagion, they preserve the mental bandwidth required to identify the elegant, high-leverage solution that others are too frantic to see. This insulation requires the systematic dismantling of the need for immediate validation. The default human conditioning craves consensus. It seeks comfort in numbers. When making a decision, the ordinary mind looks left and right to ensure its peers are approving of the trajectory. This instinct is deeply rooted in evolutionary biology, where separation from the tribe meant physical vulnerability. However, in modern strategic landscapes, this exact instinct is what guarantees mediocre outcomes. The top 1% recognize that high-level execution often requires moving ahead of the consensus or entirely independent of it. If you require the constant reassurance of others to validate your strategic direction, your pace will always be limited by their level of comprehension. True cognitive power involves becoming entirely comfortable with the silence of independent execution. It means trusting a highly calibrated internal framework over the superficial noise of popular opinion. To achieve this state of insulation, one must master the practice of emotional containment. This is frequently misunderstood as the suppression of emotion. Suppression is an unhealthy, unsustainable mechanics where an emotion is felt but forcibly pushed down, creating internal tension and eventual cognitive distortion. Containment, however, is an advanced psychological faculty. It is the ability to experience a powerful emotion, whether it is frustration, fear, or a surge of premature enthusiasm, and hold it in a state of suspended animation. You feel the impulse, you observe it with detached curiosity, but you do not allow it to translate into speech or action. You create a space between the internal stimulus and your external response. In that precise space lies your entire strategic advantage. Within that margin, the disciplined mind evaluates the emotional impulse against long-term objectives and consciously decides whether to deploy it or dismiss it entirely. This level of mastery transforms how an individual handles personal and professional friction. When a standard performer encounters criticism, opposition, or a perceived slight, the ego immediately takes the wheel. The ego demands defense, retaliation, or immediate justification. This response is highly predictable, and because it is predictable, it makes the individual easy to read and simple to neutralize. The elite strategist handles friction with an unnerving, calm neutrality. They view criticism not as an assault on their identity, but as a potential source of diagnostic data. If the criticism contains truth, they extract it and refine their system. If it is baseless, they dismiss it as irrelevant noise, refusing to waste a single joule of cognitive energy on a counter-argument. They understand that trying to prove you are right to someone committed to misunderstanding you is an absolute waste of strategic resources. Furthermore, cognitive insulation fundamentally redefines an individual's relationship with urgency. The modern workplace is designed to treat every notification, every email, and every minor request as an absolute emergency. The reactive mind spends its entire day playing defense, jumping from one superficial fire to another, guided entirely by the chime of an inbox. The top 1% structure their reality around importance, not urgency. They understand that the most critical, high-leverage intellectual work, deep strategic planning, system architecture, market analysis, and creative synthesis, requires long, uninterrupted blocks of deep focus. They do not allow their day to be fragmented by the convenience of others. They set rigorous boundaries, establishing specific protocols for access, and treating their focus time with the same reverence a surgeon treats an operating room. Let us look at how this applies to the concept of micro-choices. Every morning, you face a choice between immediate consumption and intentional production. The default habit is to check a device within minutes of waking up. By doing so, you instantly surrender your cognitive insulation. You allow the opinions, agendas, and chaotic energy of the outside world to dictate your first thoughts of the day. You start the day in a defensive, reactive posture. The exceptional individual preserves the early hours of the day as sacred space. This time is dedicated to internal alignment, strategic prioritizing, and deep analytical thought before the world is permitted to voice its opinion. This daily discipline creates a profound compounding effect. Over months and years, the insulated mind develops a level of clarity, depth, and resilience that makes their strategic output appear almost effortless to the outside observer. This is the foundational shift. You must cease to be a passive recipient of environmental stimuli and become the active, disciplined curator of your mental ecosystem. This requires a willingness to look different, to act with a level of precision that others may misinterpret as coldness, and to value the integrity of your focus above the comfort of superficial social integration. It is a quiet, unyielding commitment to excellence that operates entirely independent of external applause. When you embody this principle, your presence changes. You speak less, but your words carry significantly more weight. You do not rush to fill silences, because you are comfortable with the space required to formulate high-value thoughts. You do not react to provocations, because you realize that your emotional peace is far too valuable to be traded for a temporary ego victory. You become a steady anchor in volatile environments, an individual whose judgment remains unclouded when everything around them is shifting. This is the architecture of cognitive insulation, the essential landscape upon which all elite execution is built. The anatomy of systemic decision-making. Once the mind is insulated from external noise, it must be equipped with an advanced engine for processing reality. The default human mind makes choices based on immediate visibility and local impact. This is linear thinking. It operates on a simple mechanism of cause and effect. If I take this action, this direct result will follow. While linear thinking is functional for simple, isolated tasks, it fails catastrophically when applied to complex corporate ecosystems, market dynamics, or long-term personal trajectories. Linear choices frequently trigger unintended consequences that compound the very problems they were meant to solve. The top 1% of performers process the world through systemic decision-making. They do not view events as isolated incidents. They view them as nodes within an interconnected web of variables. Every action taken ripples through a system, altering balances, triggering feedback loops, and producing second and third-order consequences. To think like an elite strategist is to look past the immediate, visible outcome of a choice and map its downstream effects across an extended timeline. Consider an organization facing a sudden drop in productivity. A linear manager looks at the immediate data and concludes that the team lacks motivation or discipline. Their solution is direct: increase pressure, implement stricter monitoring, and demand longer hours. In the short term, this intervention may yield a temporary spike in output. This is the first-order consequence, and the linear thinker stops there, claiming victory. However, a systemic thinker looks deeper into the system's architecture. They anticipate the second-order consequence: a gradual degradation of team morale, a rise in silent resentment, and an increase in mental fatigue. Then, they project the third-order consequence: a sudden wave of departures among high-performing personnel, leaving the organization with a critical talent deficit that damages long-term operational capacity. The linear solution, designed to fix a symptom, ultimately degrades the health of the entire system. To master systemic decision-making, you must train your mind to ask a single, relentless question whenever a choice is presented: and then what? When a specific strategy is proposed, do not merely evaluate whether it solves the problem today. Ask what happens tomorrow as a result of that solution. Ask what happens in 6 months or 2 years down the line. If a short-term gain introduces long-term vulnerability, the top 1% will almost always reject it. They possess the rare discipline to accept minor, immediate friction if it preserves the long-term integrity and stability of the larger system. They do not trade future security for present convenience. This approach fundamentally alters how an individual manages risk. The standard approach to risk is binary: either avoid it entirely out of caution, or embrace it recklessly out of ambition. Both postures are emotional. The strategic mind approaches risk with probabilistic calculus. They accept that absolute certainty is an illusion, and that no framework can guarantee a perfect outcome. Instead of searching for a non-existent guarantee, they evaluate choices based on probability, asymmetry, and systemic resilience. They look for scenarios where the potential downside is contained, predictable, and survivable, while the potential upside is exponential and systemic. They do not gamble on low probability, high reward illusions. They stack the odds by making a sequence of high probability, structurally sound decisions that compound over time. A critical component of this systematic approach is the elimination of personal preference from the analytical process. The default mind evaluates choices based on what feels comfortable, what aligns with pre-existing beliefs, or what flatters the ego. This creates massive blind spots. The top 1% operate with an almost clinical objectivity. They treat their own ideas, plans, and strategies as hypotheses to be tested, rather than identities to be defended. If new data emerges that invalidates a previous strategy, they do not experience an emotional crisis. They do not double down on a failing path out of stubbornness or pride. They simply adjust the system. They decouple their self-worth from being right, redirecting their entire focus toward arriving at the most accurate understanding of reality. This structural clarity also redefines how elite performers view mistakes. To the collective mind, an error is a source of shame, a failure to be hidden or rationalized. To the systemic thinker, an error is an invaluable piece of diagnostic feedback. It is a signal that there is a flaw in the mental model or the operational system. When a breakdown occurs, they do not waste time seeking a scapegoat to blame. Instead, they conduct a rigorous, unemotional post-mortem. They trace the failure back to its systemic root. Was it a failure of information processing? Was it a breakdown in communication protocols? Was it an incorrect assumption about market behavior? By focusing entirely on fixing the system rather than assigning blame, they ensure that the same vulnerability cannot manifest twice. Furthermore, systemic thinkers are masters of feedback loops. They recognize that systems are dynamic, not static. They are constantly shifting based on internal and external inputs. Therefore, an effective strategy cannot be a rigid blueprint executed blindly. It must be a living framework that responds to real-time feedback. The top 1% build continuous feedback mechanisms into their daily execution. They actively seek out dissenting viewpoints, negative data, and early signs of friction. They understand that a critical assessment from an objective observer is far more valuable than the empty praise of an uncritical ally. By actively pursuing information that challenges their approach, they continually refine their systems, ensuring they remain resilient in the face of changing conditions. Let us bring this down to daily behavior. When you design your routine, your habits, and your career trajectory, do not think in terms of isolated goals. Do not say, "I want to achieve this specific milestone by this date." That is a linear target. Instead, focus on building a sustainable system. Ask yourself, what daily routines, what reading habits, what networks, and what cognitive exercises will inevitably generate that outcome as a natural byproduct of their operation. If you build an exceptional system, the outcomes take care of themselves. The top 1% do not obsess over the horizon. They obsess over the mechanics of the steps they are taking right now, knowing that if the geometry of the system is flawless, the destination is mathematically highly probable. This shift from linear reaction to systemic design is what separates the worker from the architect. It elevates your perspective from the ground level to the command center. You stop reacting to individual waves and begin understanding the currents that move the entire ocean. When you achieve this level of clarity, your actions take on a precision that looks like foresight to the uninitiated. It is not foresight. It is simply the natural result of a mind that sees the entire matrix of cause, effect, and compounding feedback, the strategic use of cognitive asymmetry. With an insulated mind and a systemic framework for decision-making, the elite performer is positioned to master the dynamics of engagement. To interact effectively with the world, one must develop a deep, sophisticated comprehension of human behavior. The default human approach to interaction is projection. Most people assume that others think, feel, and prioritize exactly as they do. When someone acts contrary to their expectations, the reactive mind experiences confusion, frustration, or moral indignation. This is a severe cognitive limitation. It assumes a uniformity in human nature that does not exist, leaving the individual perpetually vulnerable to unexpected behavior. The top 1% operate on the principle of cognitive asymmetry. They accept that human beings are driven by a complex, often contradictory matrix of hidden motivations, implicit biases, emotional wounds, and distinct incentives. Instead of projecting their own values onto others, the elite strategist seeks to map the unique internal terrain of every individual they encounter. They look at the world through the other person's lens, not out of passive empathy, but out of a strict requirement for clarity. They understand that you cannot effectively collaborate with, influence, or lead an individual whose core drivers you do not comprehensively comprehend. To cultivate this insight, One must master the art of disciplined observation. Most people enter an interaction focused entirely on their own output. They are preoccupied with what they will say next, how they are being perceived, and how they can assert their point of view. They treat communication as a platform for self-expression. The strategic mind treats communication as a high-value data acquisition process. When they enter a room, they speak less and observe more. They listen not just to the words being spoken, but to the pauses, the shifts in cadence, the choices of syntax, and the subtle cues that reveal what is left unsaid. They treat every interaction as an informational puzzle, gathering data points that reveal the other party's underlying incentives, insecurities, and operational standards. This level of discernment requires separating behavior from morality. When a standard performer encounters someone acting defensively, deceptively, or unproductively, their immediate reaction is to judge, condemn, or take it personally. This emotional reaction clouds their judgment and limits their strategic options. The exceptional mind handles behavioral anomalies with a clinical neutrality. If an individual acts erratically, the strategist does not take it as a personal affront. They view it as a symptom of an underlying variable within that person's psychological system. They ask, what incentive structures are driving this behavior? What fear is this person trying to manage? What past conditioning is dictating this response? By diagnosing the behavior rather than reacting to it, they preserve their strategic clarity, allowing them to formulate a response that addresses the root cause of the friction, ethically and effectively. A primary tool in this methodology is the concept of incentive alignment. The default approach to persuasion is often based on pressure, argument, or a demand for compliance. This is a low-level tactic that creates immediate friction and hidden resistance. The top 1% recognize that the most stable, ethical, and sustainable form of influence is the discovery or creation of mutual benefit. They do not waste time trying to force others to care about their objectives. Instead, they identify what the other party already values, whether it is security, recognition, autonomy, or advancement, and they frame their strategic objectives as the precise vehicle through which the other party can realize their own goals. They make collaboration the path of least resistance for everyone involved. This structural approach to human dynamics also alters how an elite thinker handles conflict. The majority view conflict through a binary framework of winning and losing. For them, a disagreement is an arena where the ego must be defended at all costs. This mindset turns minor differences into destructive wars of attrition that damage trust and deplete long-term resources. The strategic thinker views conflict as a system out of equilibrium. They do not seek a superficial victory that leaves the other party humiliated, because they recognize that a humiliated ally or competitor is a future systemic liability. They seek structural resolutions that preserve the dignity of all parties while advancing the primary objective. They look for solutions that address the core needs of the system, ensuring that the resolution is durable and does not sow the seeds of future instability. Furthermore, mastering cognitive asymmetry requires a profound understanding of social timing. The reactive mind speaks whenever it has an opinion, acts whenever it has an impulse, and pushes for closure whenever it feels anxious. This lack of impulse control makes their timing highly erratic and often counterproductive. The elite performer possesses an extraordinary capacity for strategic patience. They recognize that a brilliant idea, an impeccable proposal, or a necessary critique can fail completely if introduced into an unreceptive environment. They wait for the emotional climate to stabilize, for the right data to mature, and for the systemic variables to align. They understand that knowing when to execute is just as critical as knowing what to execute. Let us look at how this applies to personal relationships and team leadership. When you manage a team or build professional alliances, do not treat people as uniform units to be driven by a single standard directive. That is a failure of systemic imagination. Treat every individual as a distinct operating system that requires a calibrated input to produce an optimal output. One person may require high autonomy to thrive. Another may require precise structural clarity. One may respond best to quiet, analytical feedback. Another may be energized by a public acknowledgement of their contribution. By adapting your input to the specific architecture of the individual, you maximize the collective efficiency of the entire system while cultivating an environment of deep respect and mutual trust. This is not a manipulation framework. It is the ultimate expression of relational maturity and responsibility. It is the recognition that human beings are complex, delicate, and highly sophisticated entities. To lead them, to work with them, and to thrive alongside them requires that you abandon the lazy habit of self-projection and invest the mental energy required to comprehend them on their own terms. When you embody this principle, you stop fighting human nature and begin working in alignment with it. You become an individual who can navigate volatile social environments with remarkable ease, transforming potential friction into sustainable, ethical progress. The mechanics of cognitive flexibility and crisis architecture. When an individual has mastered the internal landscape of cognitive insulation and the external dynamics of human interaction, they must prepare for the inevitable arrival of systemic instability. In any high-stakes environment, volatility is not a possibility. It is a mathematical certainty. Plans, no matter how meticulously constructed, are subject to variables that cannot be predicted. The default human response to a sudden, disruptive shift in reality is cognitive rigidity. Most individuals fall in love with their initial plan, associating it with their competence and security. When the plan fails, they experience a form of psychological paralysis, attempting to force an obsolete strategy onto a changed world. The top 1% of performers operate with absolute cognitive flexibility. They treat plans not as sacred doctrines, but as temporary hypotheses. They maintain a radical detachment from the specific mechanics of execution, anchoring their focus instead on the ultimate strategic outcome. When a variable alters the landscape, they do not mourn the investment made in the old path. They instantly discard it, recalibrate their mental models, and adapt to the terrain as it exists in the present moment. They do not fight reality. They cooperate with it to find a new point of leverage. To develop this level of flexibility, you must cultivate the practice of proactive variance modeling. The reactive mind operates under the assumption that the most likely scenario is the only scenario worth preparing for. They plan for a smooth trajectory. The elite strategist continuously builds alternative mental maps. As they develop a strategy, they deliberately execute a psychological pre-mortem, asking, if this system breaks down, where is the most probable point of failure? If our primary data source is compromised, what is our secondary vector? By mentally exploring multiple variances before they manifest, they ensure that if a disruption occurs, it does not shock their nervous system. While the collective is frozen in a state of disorientation, trying to figure out what went wrong, the flexible thinker has already transitioned to a pre-calculated alternative pathway, maintaining momentum and seizing the initiative. This adaptability requires an advanced management of cognitive dissonance. Dissonance occurs when an individual is confronted with new information that directly contradicts their deeply held beliefs, their current strategy, or their past public statements. The standard human defense mechanism is denial or minimization. People will actively filter out inconvenient truths to protect their ego from the discomfort of being wrong. The top 1% treat cognitive dissonance as a critical alerting mechanism. They train themselves to lean into the discomfort of contradictory data. If a piece of information suggests their current business model is decaying or that their strategic advantage is eroding, they do not ignore it. They invite it in. They analyze it with clinical precision, recognizing that the sooner they accept an uncomfortable reality, the more time they have to strategically reposition themselves before the market forces a chaotic transition. This reframing fundamentally alters how an individual handles a crisis. In a high-pressure scenario, a sudden regulatory shift, a major operational failure, or a macroeconomic contraction, the default mind perceives an existential threat, where this perception triggers the amygdala, flooding the system with cortisol, narrowing focus to immediate survival, and crippling the capacity for high-level creative synthesis. The strategic mind views a crisis as a period of rapid structural reorganization. They understand that when a system destabilizes, old hierarchies, established monopolies, and rigid patterns dissolve. This dissolution creates an unprecedented opening for innovation and rapid advancement. While the majority is defensive, attempting to preserve a dying status quo, the elite performer looks for where the pieces will land and positions themselves to capture the new value that emerges from the reset. To execute this effectively during a crisis, you must master the principle of tactical triage. When everything appears to be breaking down simultaneously, the reactive thinker attempts to fix everything at once, scattering their energy and accomplishing nothing. The systemic architect steps back and identifies the single critical vector upon which all other elements depend. They separate the vital few from the trivial many. They allow minor subsystems to fail if doing so preserves the core operational integrity of the primary engine. They make hard, conscious trade-offs based on objective calculus, maintaining absolute composure while executing the high-leverage actions required to stabilize the foundation. Furthermore, cognitive flexibility demands the constant updating of your intellectual software. The world is an evolving ecosystem. Knowledge that was considered cutting-edge 5 years ago may be completely obsolete today. Many people build a successful framework early in their careers and spend the rest of their lives defending it, becoming relics of a bygone era. The top 1% view themselves as perpetual students. They actively seek out new fields of study, learn from younger generations, and consistently challenge their own core assumptions. They treat their mind as a dynamic sandbox, constantly importing new data, testing new methodologies, and refining their internal algorithm to ensure it matches the current complexity of the global landscape. Let us ground this in daily operational habits. Look at your current projects, your career trajectory, or your organizational structure. Are you over-indexed on a single stream of income, a single client, or a single methodology? If so, you have built a fragile system that is vulnerable to sudden disruption. To think like the top 1% is to deliberately introduce controlled stress and variance into your system before an external crisis forces it upon you. Diversify your skills, test alternative workflows, seek out feedback that makes you uncomfortable, and build structural redundancies into your life. By voluntarily exposing your frameworks to minor, manageable friction, you build a state of anti-fragility, ensuring that when the large-scale storms of reality arrive, they do not break you, they simply accelerate your progress. This is the essence of crisis architecture. It is the realization that stability is an illusion, and that true security lies not in a fixed plan or a static environment, but in your capacity to perceive reality accurately, adapt seamlessly, and execute decisively under pressure. When you embody this principle, you stop fearing change and begin to welcome it. You become an individual who thrives in chaos, transforming every sudden shift in the wind into fuel for your long-term strategic ascent. The strategic reconstruction of high-performance identity. When an individual operates with cognitive insulation, systemic decision-making, behavioral insight, and radical flexibility, they arrive at the most critical phase of transformation, the reconstruction of identity. Every action we take is ultimately a reflection of who we believe we are. The default human mind attempts to change its outcomes by focusing exclusively on behavior. People set new goals, write down new rules, and force themselves to adopt new habits through sheer willpower. This approach is highly fragile. Willpower is a limited, biochemically exhausting cognitive resource. When pressure escalates or fatigue sets in, the individual naturally defaults to the underlying identity program that has governed their life for decades. The top 1% understand that sustainable high performance is never a product of forced effort. It is a direct consequence of identity alignment. They do not fight their old habits. They systematically rewrite the internal narrative of who they are, making excellence the path of least resistance. They shift from a state of trying to achieve an outcome to a state of embodying the exact standards that make that outcome inevitable. This is not a superficial exercise in positive thinking. It is a deep, architectural overhaul of one's psychological operating system. Consider the mechanics of professional discipline. A standard performer views discipline as a form of self-punishment or a sacrifice. They wake up early, manage their time, or analyze data while constantly feeling the internal friction of wanting to do something else, because their identity is still anchored in comfort and distraction. every act of discipline requires a massive expenditure of willpower. Eventually, the reservoir empties, and they relapse into reactive behaviors. An elite performer views discipline as an act of self-reverence. Their identity is anchored in precision, mastery, and exceptional execution. For them, slipping into distraction or reacting emotionally would be a direct violation of who they are. The behavior follows the identity effortlessly, without the need for constant, exhausting psychological combat. To execute this level of internal reconstruction, you must master the principle of identity verification through micro-actions. Your mind does not form its beliefs about your identity based on empty affirmations spoken into a mirror. It forms its beliefs based on objective evidence. Every time you make a promise to yourself and break it, you vote for an identity of unreliability. Every time you allow a distraction to pull you away from deep work, you verify a program of low attentional control. Conversely, every time you choose to honor a boundary, execute a difficult task when tired, or maintain emotional composure in a crisis, you provide your brain with raw data proving your competence. The top 1% treat every small, hidden decision as a high-stakes vote for the identity they are actively constructing. They build an undeniable mountain of internal evidence until their belief in their own capability becomes a solid, unshakable reality. This identity shift requires a systematic dismantling of the need for external validation. The default human identity is highly decentralized. It is scattered across the opinions, praise, and critiques of others. Most people require constant reassurance from their peers, their superiors, or their social networks to feel successful. This makes them highly malleable and easy to destabilize. If the applause stops, their performance plummets. The elite strategist builds an inward-facing validation engine. They establish an internal set of operational standards that are significantly higher than anything the external world could ever demand of them. They do not wait for someone else to evaluate their work. They audit themselves with clinical, unyielding objectivity. If they achieve a major milestone but know their execution was sloppy, they do not celebrate. If the world criticizes them, but they know their system was flawless, they remain entirely unbothered. So they are anchored in their own metrics of excellence. Furthermore, a high-performance identity requires a complete reframing of the concept of failure to the collective mind. An operational failure is an identity-level event. When a project collapses or a venture fails, they conclude, "I am a failure." This conflation of action with identity causes profound psychological paralysis, making the individual highly risk-averse and defensive. The top 1% maintain a clean separation between their identity and their outcomes. An operational failure is simply a data point within an ongoing system experiment. It means the strategy failed, the model was incomplete, or the variables shifted. It says absolutely nothing about their inherent worth or long-term capability. By preserving their identity from the turbulence of external outcomes, they maintain the psychological safety required to take calculated risks, innovate boldly, and bounce back from setbacks with remarkable speed. This structural internal strength also redefines how elite performers view comfort. The default human program is designed to seek comfort, predictability, and safety. Once an average individual achieves a certain level of financial or professional security, they naturally plateau. They stop taking risks, they stop learning, and they focus entirely on protecting what they have already built. Their identity becomes tied to their past achievements. The top 1% view comfort as a dangerous psychological anesthetic. They recognize that growth occurs exclusively at the outer edge of their current capability, in the zone of managed discomfort. When they feel themselves becoming too comfortable, they deliberately introduce new challenges, enter new industries, or raise their operational standards, ensuring their mind remains sharp, adaptable, and perpetually oriented toward the future. Let us examine how this manifests in your daily reality. Look closely at the language you use when describing your patterns. Do you say, "I am just not a morning person. I always get overwhelmed under pressure," or "I am bad with financial details"? These are not mere descriptions of fact. They are identity scripts that you are actively reinforcing within your subconscious. To think like the top 1% is to immediately audit and delete these self-limiting narratives. Replace them with probabilistic, growth-oriented frameworks. In the past, I managed my morning energy poorly, but I am currently optimizing that system, or I am developing the capacity to process high-pressure environments with absolute clarity. By changing the language of your identity, you unlock the cognitive bandwidth required to execute the behaviors of the elite. This is the ultimate evolution of the strategic mind. You cease to be a passive product of your past conditioning, your environment, or the expectations of others. You become the deliberate, conscious architect of your own character. You build an internal fortress that is completely immune to the superficial validation of the crowd, entirely resilient in the face of temporary defeat, and relentlessly committed to the pursuit of objective mastery. When you embody this identity, your actions lose all traces of hesitation. You execute with a quiet, unyielding authority that transforms potential into a permanent, highly impactful reality. The architecture of comprehensive sustainability and long-term velocity. When an individual has engineered cognitive insulation, systemic decision-making, behavioral mastery, radical flexibility, and an aligned identity, they must confront the final operational challenge: long-term velocity. The business and performance landscapes are littered with individuals who achieved a momentary flash of brilliance, a sudden surge to the top, only to burn out, self-sabotage, or collapse under the weight of their own success. The default human approach to peak performance is characterized by erratic, unsustainable intensity. Most people operate in high-friction bursts of frantic activity, driven by anxiety or temporary inspiration, followed by deep periods of exhaustion, stagnation, and systemic decay. The top 1% view high performance not as a sprint to a finish line, but as an infinite game of comprehensive sustainability. They do not seek a temporary peak that destroys their physical, psychological, or relational infrastructure. Instead, they focus on engineering a highly optimized, closed-loop system that generates maximum strategic velocity while simultaneously regenerating its core assets. They understand that the ultimate measure of elite execution is not how fast you can run for a single quarter, but how effectively you can compound your progress over decades. Consider the phenomenon of professional burnout. A linear, low-level view of high performance equates exhaustion with productivity. The standard operator wears their lack of sleep, their poor nutrition, and their constant state of frantic stress as a badge of honor. This is a severe cognitive error. It mistakes activity for achievement. In reality, a fatigued brain is a highly compromised processing engine. Under chronic stress, the prefrontal cortex experiences reduced blood flow, crippling the capacity for high-level creative synthesis, systemic risk assessment, and emotional containment. The overworked executive becomes hyper-reactive, making short-sighted, emotionally driven decisions that introduce silent vulnerabilities into their entire organization. The elite strategist treats their biological and mental energy as a precision instrument that must be rigorously maintained. They view recovery not as an indulgence, an escape, or something that happens when the work is finished, but as a primary, non-negotiable component of the high-performance protocol itself. They understand that the brain does not grow or integrate complex data during the period of intense focus. It optimizes, consolidates memories, and repairs its neural architecture during periods of deliberate, deep decompression. By scheduling recovery with the same strategic intent they apply to a boardroom negotiation, they ensure that every time they step onto the field of execution, their cognitive apparatus is operating at absolute peak capacity, completely free from the fog of chronic fatigue. To achieve this state of long-term velocity, one must master the principle of structural leverage. The default operator attempts to scale their impact by working harder, adding more hours, and taking on more tasks themselves. This is an arithmetic approach to growth, and it hits a hard physical ceiling very quickly. The top 1% scale their impact through exponential systems, technological automation, highly calibrated operational frameworks, and strategic delegation. They ruthlessly audit their daily activities, identifying their unique zone of genius, the high-leverage decisions that only they can make, and they systematically build infrastructure to absorb or automate everything else. They do not protect their tasks, they protect their bandwidth. ensuring their mind remains free to focus on the macro trajectories that move the entire enterprise forward. This long-form perspective fundamentally transforms how an individual handles the phenomenon of momentum. The collective mind is highly susceptible to the psychological distortion of winning. When a standard performer experiences a major success, a massive financial windfall, a successful product launch, or sudden public acclaim, the ego inflates. They begin to believe their own narrative, relax their standards, and abandon the precise systems that created the success in the first place. This arrogance triggers a hidden, downward trajectory. The elite performer handles victory with the exact same calm neutrality they bring to defeat. When they win, they conduct a post-mortem to determine whether the outcome was a result of systemic excellence or mere probability. They remain entirely anchored in their core routines, recognizing that success is not a permanent destination, but a continuous condition that must be maintained through relentless adherence to high operational standards. Furthermore, comprehensive sustainability requires the proactive management of relational equity. Many ambitious individuals pursue professional dominance at the complete expense of their primary relationships, treating family, friends, and close allies as collateral damage on their path to the top. This creates a deeply fractured, fragile life architecture. The strategic mind recognizes that human beings are fundamentally relational creatures. A state of chronic relational discord creates a massive, silent tax on cognitive bandwidth. It generates background anxiety that leaks into professional judgment. The top 1% protect and nurture their inner circle with deep intentionality. They view a stable, high-trust personal foundation not as a distraction from their mission, but as the essential launchpad that provides the psychological safety and emotional resilience required to face high-stakes volatility in the global marketplace. Let us explore how this applies to your daily operational architecture. Look at your life not as a collection of separate compartments, career, health, relationships, finance, but as a singular, integrated ecosystem. If one sector is severely degraded, it will inevitably siphon energy from all the others. To think like the top 1% is to design a unified life flow system. Ensure your physical vehicle is optimized through precise nutrition and movement protocols. Ensure your mental space is preserved through daily cognitive insulation. Ensure your professional efforts are amplified through systemic leverage. When all elements of the ecosystem are aligned, the system achieves a state of perpetual momentum, where execution ceases to feel like an uphill struggle and becomes an effortless, downstream acceleration. This is the ultimate realization of the elite mind. You stop trading your health for wealth, or your peace for prestige. You understand that true power lies in the capacity to execute at an exceptional standard across an infinite timeline, without ever compromising the integrity of your mind, your body, or your values. You become a self-sustaining force of nature, an individual who moves through the world with an unhurried, devastating efficiency. While the rest of the world burns bright and burns out, your trajectory remains steady, unyielding, and relentlessly ascending, charting a course of generational impact that stands as a monument to disciplined, ethical excellence. The indelible architecture of mastery. We have journeyed through the hidden architecture of the elite mind. We have dissected the mechanics of cognitive insulation, decoded the geometry of systemic decision-making, explored the subtle landscape of behavioral alignment, mastered the fluidity of crisis architecture, and systematically rebuilt the core pillars of a high-performance identity. What emerges from this comprehensive synthesis is not a mere collection of strategies, but a singular, unified truth. Excellence is not a destination you arrive at through fortune, nor is it a temporary state you command through raw passion. Excellence is a permanent internal infrastructure. It is the natural, inevitable byproduct of a mind that has chosen absolute clarity over immediate convenience. As you step back into the active arena of your daily reality, you must accept that the world you encounter will continue to operate on its default programming. The collective crowd will remain hyper-reactive, chasing the fleeting glitter of short-term validation, scattering its attention across trivial distractions, and allowing every passing storm to hijack its emotional peace. You will be surrounded by noise, but the profound shift that has occurred within you means that while you must operate in that world, you are no longer of it. You have built your fortress, you have established your insulation. Remember that the ultimate test of this architecture does not occur when the conditions are perfect. It is remarkably easy to maintain a strategic posture when the market is rising, the team is aligned, and the path ahead is entirely visible. Anyone can simulate mastery in calm waters. The true measure of your transformation will manifest in the quiet, high-stakes moments of absolute friction. It will show up when a critical venture collapses, when an unexpected betrayal tests your emotional containment, or when the sheer weight of a prolonged crisis threatens to cloud your analytical precision. In those precise seconds, the default mind screams for a reaction. The elite mind breathes, steps back, and observes the variables. In those moments of intense pressure, you must consciously summon the principles we have established. You must look past the immediate, visible symptom and trace the downstream currents of the entire system. You must isolate your consciousness from the surrounding panic, treating the crisis not as an assault on your identity, but as a complex data set waiting to be solved. You must decouple your ego from the need to be right, remaining entirely flexible, entirely objective, and ruthlessly committed to the pursuit of what is real. You do not force an answer out of anxiety. You allow strategic clarity to emerge from disciplined observation. Carry this understanding into how you view your fellow human beings. Let go of the lazy habit of self-projection and replace it with a deep, sophisticated commitment to ethical comprehension. Stop demanding that the world conform to your immediate expectations. Instead, master the art of observing human nature as it is, mapping the hidden incentives, fears, and structures that drive behavior. When you move through the world with this level of discernment, you cease to be a victim of interpersonal friction. You become a steady, stabilizing anchor, an individual who can cultivate high-trust alliances, build mutual benefit, and guide complex teams through volatile landscapes with absolute integrity and grace. Above all, guard the integrity of your identity with unyielding reverence. Never forget that every choice you make when no one is watching, every boundary you honor, every distraction you decline, every difficult piece of data you choose to look at rather than ignore, is a high-stakes vote for the character you are constructing. Do not trade your long-term strategic velocity for the cheap, temporary narcotic of immediate comfort. Build an internal validation engine that demands more of you than any external critic ever could. Let your standards be your signature. The path we have charted is not an easy one. It requires a willingness to look different, to act with a precision that others may mistake for coldness, and to accept the profound solitude that often accompanies high-level independent thought. It is a path of relentless accountability, deep self-regulation, and continuous cognitive updating. But the reward for this discipline is absolute freedom. It is the freedom from being managed by your environment. It is the capacity to look at a volatile, unpredictable future and know with complete internal certainty that whatever variables manifest, your processing engine will adapt, your system will absorb the shock, and your trajectory will remain relentlessly ascending. The words have been spoken, the blueprints have been laid bare, the architecture of the top 1% is now integrated into your awareness. But information without execution is merely intellectual entertainment. The true synthesis happens now, in the choices you are about to make, in the silence of your own mind, and in the deliberate, powerful precision of your next move. Step forward into your reality, not as a passive participant, but as the master architect of your destiny. Maintain your calm, preserve your focus, execute your vision,